3,000-meter runways, which can, fighter capable, with can deploy frontline aircraft with defenses of every nature. All Chinese shipyards are engaged in both defense and civil.
That is lacking in India at the moment.
Because the fear is always that in the first strike, they will take out your nuclear assets, and then you're left defenseless. Russia has lost 30% of their navy, and all through the audacious use of unmanned assets. So we have to develop similar capabilities ourselves.
What is the state of our relationship at the moment, according to you?
Most of our marine gas turbines actually come from Ukraine.
But do you think their equipments are at par with the Chinese and the US?
Surface detection is becoming easier and easier by the day, largely based on satellite-based assets. Undersea detection still remains a problem. And to my mind, the only country which has been successful in doing that is China. Our focus has to shift from money spent on defense is not money spent on infrastructure, on health, different aspects of internal security, etc., to how we can deploy that money more effectively.
What is the threat according to you, sir? How big is the threat? Today, we are honored to have with us a distinguished naval strategist, Rear Admiral Monty Khanna, whose illustrious career in the Indian Navy spans over 3 decades, from commanding submarines and frigates to serving as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., and guiding India's naval strategy as Commandant of the Naval War College. Admiral Khanna brings a wealth of experience to the table. In this episode, we take a deep dive into the evolving US-India relationship, the strategic complexities of India's defense ties with Russia, and how the Ukraine conflict impacts global security. Admiral Khanna offers his candid insights on whether Russia's defense industry remains a reliable partner for India, why Ukraine's path forward is fraught with challenges, and the necessity for diplomatic negotiations to prevent further destruction. We'll also explore the strategic role of nuclear submarines in national defense, particularly their significance as a second strike capability, an essential component of India's maritime security. So, whether you are a student of geopolitics, defense strategy, or just curious about the inner workings of global power dynamics, this conversation is one you don't want to miss. Let's get started. Before we dive into today's conversation, I just wanted to take a quick moment. We looked at our analytics and noticed that 93% of you who watch our videos regularly aren't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying our content and want us to keep going with more insightful conversation, we'd really appreciate if you could take just a second to subscribe. It might seem like a small action, but it goes a long way in helping us grow and bringing even more amazing content your way. Thanks for your support. It means the world to us. Now let's get back to the video. So I would like to ask you, you spent some years in the US as the naval attaché in Washington, D.C. Do you want to tell me a little about your experience there, sir?
Yeah, so I was there from roughly around June 2008 to around September 2011. Fortunately, it was not my first experience to the United States, because I was a student at the US Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island from 2004 to 2005. So I had a little familiarity with the way they are set up and how they do things, which I think for a naval attaché puts you on a pedestal straight away, because you're not all that new to the country, particularly from a security standpoint. It was a pivotal time in the US. I mean, this was the time of the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Obama taking over in January 2009. In fact, we were part of the crowds outside Capitol, because it was an exciting time to be there. From a security standpoint, I think it was a transformational relationship at that time, where from a position of mistrust, I think we were moving to a position of trust. That was the default position, the change that was taking place. So in all capacities, a lot more being done on interoperability, on joint exercises. But I think the pivotal things insofar as the Navy was concerned was the acquisition piece, where for the first time, big ticket items of defense were being procured from the United States. And the biggest of them, I would say, would be the PATI contract. 8 large aircraft for surveillance, $2.1 billion deal. Apart from the Navy, the Air Force was also doing the C-17, the C-130s. So this was quite a transformational time.
So how did that reflect in the India-US relations at that time?
I think in all dimensions, there was a significant ramp up that took place. There were numerous, visits by our leadership, both defense as well as at the Prime Minister level. In fact, while I was there, the Prime Minister came 5 times in the 3 years that I was there, which is quite, I would say, unprecedented. So, in all levels, there was a significant ramp up. There was a lot of conversation at that time regarding the foundational agreements, which finally became the LEMOA, which was the first one we eventually signed. But negotiations were on at that time. COMCASA, which became SISMOA, and finally, I think Becca. So all three are now behind us. But a lot of the spade work was commenced at that time. And this was also, I think, just before I got there was the conclusion of the nuclear deal. So things were already on a high. I think the nuclear deal was really transformational because that set us in a different space insofar as the Indo-US relationship is concerned.
What do you think are the sentiments of the India-US relationship now? Like, they aren't very happy about our relationship with Russia. We aren't happy with how they used to give arms and arms deals with the Pakistanis. So what is the state of our relationship at the moment, according to you?
They are aware of our requirement to be engaged with Russia. And in all our conversations with the United States, this has been conveyed in uncertain terms that we have a legacy relationship with them that we value. We have a large part of our a certain amount of defense dependencies also, which have to be sort of sustained because we have a lot of legacy equipment. And all said and done, we see value in engaging Russia. To some extent, I think even China plays into this because, alienation of Russia by all parties will result in closer linkages between Russia and China, which is detrimental to our security. So I think whatever be the public articulation, to my mind at least, the US is aware of these issues that we have. And I don't think it's a fundamental point of discord. Insofar as, their material assistance to Pakistan is concerned, even these have time to time been conveyed to the United States. And I think over the years, it has diminished and got limited to very few segments. What used to be at one stage where the US used to see some degree of parity in this relationship, of their relationship between Pakistan and India, that has transformed over the years altogether. Today, there's no question of parity. I mean, they put us in a different place and Pakistan in a different place. So it has evolved over the years, and I think we can learn to live with our differences.
Our relationship with Russia is mainly in terms of kind of trade we do with them in defense, in oil. Do you think their defense industry is reliable for us, especially when they are at a war at the moment?
I mean, in the past, we have no reason to feel that they are not. And so far, I don't think there has any historical evidence to show that they are not reliable as a supplier. One can understand there have been issues. There have been issues in the past also when the Soviet Union collapsed. Their defense industry for a short time was in disarray and supplies were affected, but we went past that time. Even now, they are in conflict. And therefore, you find that I'm sure that a lot of their defense production is being consumed in sustaining this conflict with Ukraine. But all the same, big ticket deals, be it the S-400, etc., maybe a few delays here and there, but they are going through. And I think it is in their interest also not to let these precipitate or go down beyond a certain point, because, it is important for Russia to convey not only to us, but even globally, that they are a reliable defense supplier. Otherwise, they'll start losing out on large segments of their market. So they will have to weigh this.
But do you think their equipments are at par with the Chinese and the US?
When you talk about par, you have to see value for money. I mean, it's you can get the best of equipment at the best of price, and you can get value for equipment at value for and pay for what you think you're getting. Secondly, is that you've got a lot of legacy Russian equipment which has to be sustained, and as we are ramping up on a certain amount of localization in their sustainment, but dependencies still exist on certain key items. On BrahMos, on aero engines, on marine gas turbines, etc. These dependencies still exist, and they will take time to address. So you got certain requirements in which we will continue to be have to use the Russians as a supplier. And while I think they are in a sense assisting us also in addressing these dependencies, but that is still some distance away until we can sort of wean ourselves totally away. The strategic side of the engagement is also important to us. So we can't say that this is purely a buyer-seller relationship. I mean, there is a strategic element to that relationship. Russia is a large country. It's a large energy supplier to us. Apart from defense, I mean, the China equation I've already told you. We have complex security situations around us. Russia largely in larger global bodies, be it the United Nations Security Council, has largely stood by us in whenever its push has come to shove. So it is in our interest to, I would say, to sustain that relationship as well. Yeah.
So, PM Modi recently visited Ukraine, and before that, he visited Russia. I saw these meetings as when I was thinking about this. There's Russia. There's a lot of talks about the hard power, and in Ukraine, there were more talks about soft power. Do you think I'm on the right track in the thinking?
I mean, I'm not privy to the discussions that took place because most of these would have been closed door discussions. But broadly, I would say that you are correct that with Ukraine right now, we are talking more on the humanitarian angle of things. Their losses have been devastating in a sense on both sides, but Russia can still sustain themselves. Ukraine finds it difficult to sustain themselves in the current predicament they are. And certainly from a humanitarian side, be it in medical equipment, be it in, on the softer side of issues, it would be in order for us to sort of assist them through this period of turmoil that they're currently going through. For them, I mean, apart from the losses they have faced, thousands of people who, apart from those who've been killed, who are wounded, who need sort of medical treatment, who need, so this is something I think from a humanitarian side we should be conscious of. And there is a reason also because we do have certain, I would say, strategic dependencies, not dependencies, but strategic requirements to engage Ukraine also. Most of our marine gas turbines actually come from Ukraine. So there is pieces of equipment that we have in which have got Ukrainian origins. And to sustain that also, we need to keep Ukraine engaged. So we have to balance our relationship slightly in this manner.
Ukraine recently attacked Russia as well. What are your thoughts on that, sir?
I mean, from a Ukrainian perspective, if you see your current conflict that you're happening in the Donbass region has reached, it's not exactly a stalemate, but they are gradual advances that the Russians are making over there.
In 2 years, this is the first time we saw a Ukrainian offensive.
Yeah. If you're going to just continue fighting the way you were, and Russia is making incremental gains over there, your ability to change the course of this conflict is bleak.
True.
So you have to do something new. If you're looking at putting yourself into a negotiating position for ending the conflict, you have to do something that is out of the box. And if you can capture a certain amount of Russian territory, what they're doing in Kursk right now, through an offensive, though it might have certain, on the eastern side of Ukraine, you might have certain, you might have depleted yourself to some extent for that offensive in Kursk to take place. But if you can take control of certain amount of Russian territory, it puts you in a better negotiating position to arrive at a long-term solution, which one hopes the earlier it takes place, the better. Because at the end of the day, I mean, this is what we also need to tell the Americans and the Europeans. I don't think this conflict is going to end with any side losing, so to speak. Russia is too large to sort of fail in that sense. I mean, and now they've shifted their entire economy into a wartime economy to support this conflict. Ukraine, even though it's much smaller, but with all the support they're getting from NATO and from Europe, I think, they don't have any real shortage of resources. So while there might be small incremental changes, to expect that any side to really go belly up and to say that, I'm throwing in the towel and I'm done with this conflict is wishful thinking. It therefore has to end in some sort of negotiation. There has to be a negotiated settlement. And if negotiations are going to eventually take place, then why not bring forward those negotiations? The earlier you do the negotiations, the better. Then why go through the bitterness and the destruction, the mutual destruction that is taking place? So I think that is a message we need to send out to all parties, and I'm sure our government is doing it too. If you're going to end this conflict finally with negotiations, the earlier you do the negotiations, the better.
The key problem of this conflict was Ukraine wanting to join NATO.
Yeah.
That isn't happening now.
In those negotiations, each party will come out with certain red lines. And then you have to mutually see as to, what is acceptable and what is not. But at least that conversation has to start. If Europe feels at times that, this is an existential issue for them and it would be sort of, I would say, appeasement of Russia. But what is the alternative in a sense? What is the alternative? I mean, you can't defeat Russia. Then are you going to say that this conflict should perpetuate in without any closure? The end game has to sort of come out. If the end game is going to be a negotiated settlement, then do it early. I mean, that's the bottom line that I'm trying to say.
There were similar agreements when there was a breaking of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
The agreement that now none of the Soviet Union countries then could be a part of the NATO. Shouldn't that be respected?
There was a broad understanding, though it might be contested, that when the Soviet Union went down, there was a broad agreement that was made that the eastward expansion of NATO would not take place, right? Now that has happened to quite an extent. From a Russian perspective, I mean, while they've allowed that to happen up to an extent, but they feel that Ukraine would be the bottom line. Yeah, that it would affect their security in too large a way for them to accept. I think there's a understanding to quite an extent on the West also of this, because while Ukraine has been pressing for membership of NATO, there's been some reticence from the Western side as well to admit them. Because if you're going to create a fault line that is going to perpetuate conflict, and then once, if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, Article 5 kicks in, an attack on one is an attack on all, then there's no limitation to this conflict in that case. A conflict has the easy ability to scale itself into a global conflict, into a world war, practically. So no one wants to get into that sort of a situation.
So coming back to the US,
Yeah.
we see that all these conflicts help boost the defense industry in the US. Is that true? Do you believe that to be true?
Yeah, I would agree that there's a large part of, if you see all of European countries, they're all ramping up their defense spending from 1% to 2% of GDP. Countries like Japan, etc., have also ramped up their spending. The US itself, I mean, $900 billion roughly, the defense budget. And even what Europe buys, a large part of these contracts are going to US companies. The F-35, for example, is becoming the standard aircraft, which most countries are adopting. So I'm sure there are, from the defense industrial complex, there are, I would say, it's a period of sunshine for them, so to speak. But at the same time, I think one should realize that whenever you spend money on defense, there's an opportunity cost to it. Money spent on defense is not money spent on infrastructure, on health, on different aspects of internal security, etc. In the US, for example, if you see the infrastructure today, it's quite weak as compared to China, for example. You don't have high-speed rail in the US, which is quite odd for a nation like the United States. The highway system was created in the Eisenhower time, but I don't think their bridges, etc., have not sort of been redeveloped since that period. So there's a large lag which they're trying to address right now, for which you require deployment of resources. So this is, you have to sort of think this through fully. I mean, and I think that was the fundamental premise of even Trump, even though his articulation might have been different, that instead of deploying resources, fighting battles in Europe or in other parts of the globe, in Afghanistan, where he also advocated for a pullout, that you bring those resources back home and deploy them in country. Yeah.
Our Defense Minister Rajnath Singh recently visited the US and signed a couple of deals. Do you want to put light on that, sir?
So this is an ongoing process. The security of supplies agreement, these are all, I would say, moving along from the fundamental three agreements that were put in place. Before, GSOMIA was of course signed earlier. And then, as I said, you had LSA, you had SISMOA, and then you had BECA. These agreements are essentially put the building blocks in place for you to be able to interoperate with the US. For example, in LSA, we used to have a fuel supply agreement between the two navies for several years before LSA was signed. But there were limitations in that. You could only use US tankers to refuel your ships at sea in certain specific areas. Particularly, it was designed while we were deployed for anti-piracy missions. Instead of using our own tankers, we could lift off fuel of American tankers as well while at sea through undersea replenishment. The LSA broadens that agreement. So it's not only confined to a certain area, but it can be done globally. So essentially, what it means is that otherwise, every time you need something, you have to go in for a separate agreement. So here with the LSA, it puts a global umbrella to that, where you can lift off supplies from them and they can take from you. And at the end of the year, you do your bookkeeping and you square the account. SISMOA is essentially a communication security agreement, where if you're using certain pieces of US equipment, if you have not signed this agreement, then because that equipment is regarded as secure, if that equipment was coming to you, there was a contingent of US people who used to come along with that equipment to protect that equipment and to ensure that it was not dismantled, seen, taken away, whatever it is. With SISMOA, that's no longer a requirement, and plus it gives you access to certain GPS, for example, has got a precise positioning, has got a standard positioning. So if you're using certain missiles, etc., you want the precise positioning signal, for which you have to be a signatory of SISMOA. BECA gives you access to certain geospatial maps, etc. And now with SOSA and additional agreements that we are happening, it is basically we are saying that our suppliers of defense equipment, as part of the supply chain, if we can build up resilience by mutual dependencies and give priority to companies in our two countries as part of our supply chains, defense supply chains, then it facilitates that. Over the years, you'll find that these agreements are just increasing the amount of interlinkages that we can have with the United States as a security partner.
There has been a reciprocal agreement with them that both of us will have to buy equipments from each other. What does that mean for India? Does it mean that we have come, in terms of Atmanirbhar Bharat, we have come a long way in terms of our manufacturing, and that US is wanting to do a reciprocal deal with us?
See, there is no compulsion in any of these agreements. It's not that I have to buy from you. The agreements
There is a compulsion now, so.
There is no compulsion. Even with SOSA, there's no compulsion. The agreements are so designed that if you want to buy from the other party, the process is much easier. So it's just smoothing out the process. No agreement is going to say that I have to buy from you.
Is it?
Yeah, that is always a sovereign decision, as to whether if I want to do something homegrown, if I want to go somewhere else, you're always free to do that. And I don't think anyone can trade away that right in any country. So it's just that in case I want to come to you, that process should be as smooth as possible. And that's what these agreements are designed to do.
Does this collaboration itch the Chinese and the Russian in terms of our relationship with the US?
Obviously, insofar as China is concerned, any movement on our side towards closing of relations is an issue for them. But they have to live with it. I mean, if you are not willing to address broader security issues on the northern boundary, then we will find our own ways to sort of strengthen ourselves. And if we have to resort to a certain amount of external balancing to do that, we will do that. So it can't be a one-way street that, we won't address this issue. The Chinese don't anyway have a veto on what we do.
Yeah.
It's for us to decide. But certainly, I think it is in Chinese interest to make sure that there is some degree of balance, and part of that process has to be addressing the northern border. As long as it remains a sticky point, the desire from our side to resort to external balancing while we do things internally, but to use external balancing also as a tool, will continue to remain.
So China is leading towards a maritime power. What can India learn from their systems and processes in terms of where they are getting to at the moment?
China's rise as a maritime power has been phenomenal. And it is not something that existed through the ages. It's something quite recent.
Yeah.
I would say it started after Deng Xiaoping became the ultimate leader of China. Yeah. This is something from the 80s. And his first focus was actually commercial shipbuilding. And that's where they started off from. And there was a militarization that was happening at the same time. But the real focus was commercial. And then when they started building ships and submarines, they first focused on the smaller craft, as this was part of their, near seas active defense. Their philosophy was to protect the coastline and a little beyond that, up to the first island chain, and then subsequently up to the second island chain. And it's only, I would say the transformational period is around 2010, 2012, where they have really started building a global navy. But the building blocks to do that were based on a strong commercial output. So if you see China today, they are the largest shipbuilding nation in the world. They are the largest port operator in the world. They are amongst the largest providers of seafarers in the world. They are now, by numbers, I would say the largest navy in the world, maybe not by tonnage, but by numbers they are. The largest coast guard in the world, the largest deep sea fishing fleet in the world. On any maritime parameter, if you take, they would be either the number one or number two right now. And now they have utilized that once they've built up the capacities to become a global navy as well. I mean, building between 15 to 25 ships per year is not an easy task. but they're churning them out, and they're churning them out fast. And the ships are quite capable. It's not that they're large destroyers with, you see the Type 55 destroyer, extremely powerful ship, 12 to 15,000 ton displacement, 112 tubes, so it's these are frontline powerful ships. What we can learn from them, I think, is firstly, we need to become a seafaring nation in all aspects. And that's strengthen our commercial shipyards as well. You have to use that as a building block. Second is this whole thing of civil cooperation. All Chinese shipyards are engaged in both defense and civil, and each sort of are assist each other.
That is lacking in India at the moment.
We are lacking that in India because most countries, most of our shipyards feel that commercial construction is risky, and therefore it is easier to move on to defense construction where your payments are short and orders are short, etc. But it might be risky, but it can be. If you are doing it well, then you should be able to, compete at least in certain classes of vessels, particularly now because shipping right now is booming. Absolutely, there's a huge demand for ships. Right? So civil is certainly the next area. And third, I would say, is China is very efficient in converting capital into assets. The cost of construction is extremely low. If you say that there is a differential between the nominal value of your currency and your purchasing power, in China, the differential is roughly 1 is to 1.95. In India, the differential is actually 1 is to 3.5 or 3.7. So logically, if you buy a ship in India, cost should be 1/3 or 1/4 it costs you to build in a Western country. Yeah. But we're not finding the differential. We're still as expensive, practically, and sometimes even more expensive. The 1135.6 that we're building in Goa are more expensive than buying them from Russia. We need to sort of make our yards much more efficient and probably do a lot more Indianization, particularly in the MSME sector is really coming up quite well in this respect, to make sure that the cost of production of defense equipment in India is significantly lower than what it is in the West and achieve the same levels that China has been able to achieve. Because that's the only way that you'll be able to really build, with a limited budget. Our focus has to shift from demanding more money to how we can deploy that money more effectively in creating assets. That's what I would feel. So these are things we can certainly learn from China.
So does China also sell these equipments that they make?
I think they now emerged as they're still ramping their way up. If I have my facts right, they are now the 4th or the 5th largest defense supplier globally. But their biggest
in maritime, sir, like ships and submarines.
Yeah, but their biggest suppliers are nations around us. 8 submarines going to Pakistan, 4 frigates which have recently gone there, plus 3 frigates which have gone there earlier. Myanmar, they've given 1 submarine and they're engaged in their frigate programs which are taking place. In Bangladesh, the corporate program, mainly second-hand vessels which have been going there, and plus the 2 Ming-class submarines. So around us, if you see, I would say Pakistan's dependency on China is now 70-80%, in terms of the equipment that is coming into there. 8 submarines is not a small quantity. It's a large order. It's $5 to $6 billion is the total value of that order. And I think the market that they're largely going to eat into is the Russian market. Because Russia right now is constrained on what they can supply because of the conflict going on. China has entered the same market of value for money. Which is a segment that a lot of countries in Latin America and Africa find it worthwhile to. So as a consequence, in these countries, you're finding that their procurement from China is going up quite fast. So I won't be surprised if in the next few years they emerge as a 3rd largest defense supplier in the world after the US and Russia probably.
So when we speak about China's maritime rise, we also must talk about the threat that China brings in the South China Sea to all the nations around there. What is the threat according to you? So how big is the threat?
Yeah, so it is definitely an issue. China has changed the geography of the region also by the artificial island construction. They've built, there's the Spratlys. They have got 3 large airfields which have been built, 4 large helipads which have been built. So 7 sort of structures that you have made. And these are enormous. You've reclaimed 3,200 acres of land you've created, out of reefs. And these facilities are robust. You're talking about 3,000 meter runways, which can, fighter capable, with can deploy frontline aircraft with defenses of every nature. And then, you create this 9-dash line, geopolitical statement that you've pushed out. And even when it is challenged in court, and the court gives a ruling, international court, it gives you the PCA, the Permanent Court of Arbitration gives a ruling that this is incorrect, and China is a signatory of UNCLOS. you junk that judgment, and you say, our claims predate any judgment that is given in this respect. It is an iterative change that they're making all the time. So this whole philosophy of China, what they call salami slicing, is what the Western use, or 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Every time you create a crisis, or if a crisis emerges, you create a new status quo which is always more in your favor than the last it was. So there's an iterative change that is happening all the time. But it's all driven by a growing ability to project power. As you're becoming more and more powerful, your ability to project power further and further from your coastline is increasing all the time. And therefore, you find that there's a fundamental change that is coming in this area. There is a pushback. It'll be interesting to see how this pushback sort of manifests itself. You're seeing collisions between Philippine Coast Guard vessels and Chinese vessels. I think over the last 10 days, there have been 2 collisions already. So you're reaching, I would say, an inflection point where one way or the other, either there has to be a clearer understanding, or, the probability of a chance conflict can only increase with time. Yeah.
It's not just the South China Sea that they're gaining influence, they're also gaining influence in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
How is India countering that influence, according to you, sir?
As China's navy becomes bigger and they start building bigger and bigger ships, their influence globally will increase. What really brings them to the Indian Ocean, if you ask me, is that so far the so-called global policeman, from a maritime sense, has been the United States Navy, right?
Yeah.
They were the dominant power, and they were able to intervene anywhere globally. And they were sort of used to underwrite, I would say, maritime security in a global context. And all nations used to depend on this sort of security being provided by the US Navy and its allies. Now, insofar as China is concerned, that relationship has broken down. And they can no longer rely on the US Navy to protect their trade and things like that. Fundamentally, they feel forced to come over here to address a growing weakness that is developed, and also to gain influence, also to their interaction. So there are many reasons why they're coming. One is, of course, trade protection. They have got large investments in Africa, in all of South Asia as well. They have got a large diaspora, which at times needs to be sort of protected. If you're a large trading nation, you've got investments, you've got requirement for resources, you've got requirements for places to sell your products, and therefore, apart from trade, you require that access. You require influence. Influence is always, I would say, zero sum. If someone has to gain influence, someone has to lose influence. Particularly in Africa, I would say the influence is ramping up quite significantly, and so in West Asia. So these are all the drivers that are bringing them here. From our perspective, whatever be the drivers to bring them here, the fact is that it impacts us. If their ships are here in large numbers, so far we are seeing on an average of around 5 to 6 ships here at any given time. Largely 3 as part of the anti-piracy squadron, and then they turn around, and then the ships generally hang around for some time over here before they go back. Sometimes they have other requirements when ships come over here. So 6 to 7 ships would be quite the norm of grey hulls. Apart from that, you have the survey and research ships, which are constantly here undertaking some marine acoustic surveys over here, either for oil prospecting or but this information is all dual use. It can be utilized for enhancing your information on effective submarine operations also. There are many things that we can do, but as they come over here in larger numbers, we have to change the way our Navy sort of thinks and functions. Because so far we have been we've not had a major adversary in the Indian Ocean. And therefore, we've developed as a Navy which has largely been capability based. That, you want capabilities on anti-submarine, on anti-air, on carriers, on expeditionary operations. But if you have a new player who's coming, who is impacting your security, then I think your philosophy has to change to a more threat-based approach now. So you counter certain specific aspects of the threats that he can put on you instead of a capability-based approach.
True.
And I think that change, to my mind, has to take place. And what will be the dimensions of that change can be quite sort of profound. The second issue I would say is that you have to start looking at asymmetric options. Take our defense budget. If you take, I'm talking about, say, 2003, 2004 figures, because that's for China, we have only those figures. Our Navy capital budget was to the tune of around just short of 60,000 crores. Yeah, so you're talking about maybe around $6 billion. Yeah. I don't know, around 52,000 crores, if I'm not mistaken. China's budget, if you take, the defense budget for 2003 to 2004 was 1.55 trillion yuan, which comes to $220 billion. But if you take SIPRI, if you take IISS, they all say that China underreports, so they mark it up by another 50%. So it's $330 billion. In that, what share goes to the Navy? But let's assume between 25 to 30%, so between 80 to $100 billion to the Navy. China's capital spending is high, in excess of 50%. So you're talking about $50-60 billion. You're looking at capital spending of $6.5 billion to around $50 to $60 billion. Naval spending. Around 10 times. And then you're looking at, their ability to convert capital into resources, as we discussed earlier, is much higher. So their ability to bring force, if you're going to go force versus force, or you're going to go, you're going to match them asset for asset, it's going to be extremely difficult. You will not be able to do it. So you have to look at asymmetric options. You're looking at forces, what is happening in Iran, what is happening in Ukraine, where asymmetric options have also been useful. So I'm not saying this transition has to be done in one shot or suddenly, but the drift has to be in that direction. That you look at low-cost options with the possibility for high effects and leverage geography. If he's coming here, he's at 3,000-4,000 miles away from his bases here. Because geography is complicated. Our geography with China is quite unique. We share a common border, but from a maritime standpoint, you're 4,000 miles apart. They has to come through one of the straits, has to get through the first iron chain, the second iron chain, come through one of the Indonesian straits, and then come over here. So he's on extended lines, and you're on short lines. So use these to your advantage so that you present a credible threat at all times. So that's what I would say.
And we need to strengthen our relationship as well in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, so certainly, what you do yourself is one side of the story. And the second side is there's always this element of external balancing. So the more, you always will have certain capability gaps. While you resort to external balancing, I think you have to remember, in the absence of an alliance structure, what external balancing can achieve will always be limited. And we have to be conscious of those limitations. So they should not be over-reliance, on external partners. Because if you don't have an alliance, there's only so much you can do.
A lot of the influence and in deterrence nowadays in maritime is based on your nuclear submarine capabilities as well.
Yeah.
And a minimum fleet of nuclear submarines in today's time should be about 4. A lot of big powers have a minimum of 4. Why does India not have 4 at the moment, sir? And what is the importance of having a 4? Also, if you could share that.
So you're talking about, actually, nuclear submarines come in 2 categories. There are the ballistic missile carrying submarines, which are part of your strategic deterrence. And I think the 4 you're referring are to the SSBNs. And then there are the attack submarines, the SSNs, which are, they don't carry, they're not strategic. They carry conventional weapons, but they're nuclear powered. So how nations come to 4 or 5, SSBNs is based on a requirement to what is called maintained continuous at-sea deterrence. Particularly as a nation, if you say that you have no first-use policy, then you should have an assured second strike capability, right? Because the fear is always that in the first strike, they will take out your nuclear assets, and then you're left defenseless. But if I have an asset at sea, a submarine, which is undetected, then that assurance for a second strike is always available with me. True. To maintain one submarine always at sea, it depends on the type of submarines that you have and your material state and your confidence. But a minimum of 4 is what is normally required to keep at least one submarine at sea. As your submarines become more reliable, maybe you can start maintaining 1 point something. But otherwise, so that's why you find the UK has got a fleet of 4 ballistic missile submarines. France has got a fleet of 4. Well. The Chinese are building up more. And US has got now, out of the 18 Ohio class, 4 have been converted to SSGN. So you've got 14 ballistic missile submarines. And Russia, I think, would be having probably 8 to 10. Now, their requirements are higher because they feel that they require to maintain more than 1 nuclear submarine, ballistic missile carrying submarine on patrol. In fact, as per open sources, the US maintains 5 to 6 submarines at sea at any given time, right? But a short second strike, you need that at least 1. Now that's the ballistic missile submarines. Attack submarines are a totally different ballgame. In a conventional submarine, which is running on batteries, you require to recharge your batteries from time to time. Yeah. So that means you have to come up to snorkeling depth. You stick out a snort mast. You take in air. you run your diesels, you recharge your batteries, and you submerge again. Since your batteries are finite and you can't have that much power, if you're going fast, like any electric car today. If you go fast, or you're depleting your power fast, so you'll run for a few hours and you'll run out of your batteries. If you go slow, you might last out for a couple of days at most, and then you have to come up again. In today's requirement, every time you come up, you have various ways and means of monitoring the surface, and your chances of getting detection go up quite significantly. Plus, when you're running diesels, you're making noise, you're generating, so your chances for acoustic detection also go up significantly. So you have air independent propulsion systems that can allow you to remain submerged for long durations, maybe up to 2 weeks, but their power generation ability is low in kilowatts, 200 kilowatt, 300 kilowatt, etc. So you can't go at high speeds, but I can chug along at 2, 3 knots, 4 knots at pretty low speeds and remain submerged for longer durations in a conventional submarine also. But the gold standard is a nuclear power plant that makes me truly air independent. And since these nuclear power plants are powerful, I can sustain high speeds also underwater. So we require both. We require ballistic missile carrying submarines. We already have Arihant, and open source tells us that there are more coming after that. And hopefully at some stage we will achieve continuous at sea deterrence. But on attack submarines, we had one on lease, Chakra, which has gone back. And we are hopeful that we acquire this capability homegrown as well, because it's a game-changing weapon. You can go fast, you can go far, you can go undetected, and therefore you have this ability to influence a large expanse of ocean. And everyone's in doubt because with the ship these days, largely through you're reaching a stage of assured maritime domain awareness where a location of your ship will be practically known. But with an undersea weapon, no one knows where you are. So they have to cater for the fact that you might be, anywhere. So that brings in a stage of complexity which is difficult, which is much more difficult to sort of combat.
So what kind of technological advancement and defense modernization should India expect in the coming years?
So there are many areas, I would say, that you have to do. To name a few, frontline, of course, is the growing importance of low-cost unmanned assets. You're seeing that in Ukraine, where you can say it's a confined space of water, but not that confined. The Black Sea is a pretty large expanse of water, 700 kilometers from one side to the other, I think, 700 miles. I mean, when this conflict started, I think the Ukrainian Navy as a fighting force ceased to exist in the first week of conflict. They were wiped out, whatever few ships they had. But more than 2 years into the conflict, Russia has lost 30% of their navy, and all through the audacious use of unmanned assets. So this is a new lesson, I think, that has come in, where we have to see as to how best and to what extent you can apply modern day unmanned assets. The second is, I would say, is a new generation of weapons to pose a threat as well as to defend yourself against a threat. These days, the ability to throw things at you when you're a ship, be it loitering munitions, be it cruise missiles, was conventional, and the new generation anti-ship ballistic missile, which is practically a game-changing weapon where you can reach long distances and engage ships at sea. So we have to develop similar capabilities ourselves, as well as capabilities to defend yourself against such weapons. Is basic. So these are all asymmetric weapons in a sense. Another thing I think we can do is, you have to go distributed, in a sense that weaponization or rapid weaponization of the maximum number of assets that you can do. We've got a limited number of grey hulls, but we've got a lot more, and all those grey hulls are not armed. For example, your corvettes, your frigates, and your destroyers might be armed, but you have ships like your hydrographic ships, you have ships like your offshore patrol vessels, you have ships like your diving support ships. There's a large number of auxiliaries that you have, where I think we should have the ability for rapid weaponization. So these days it's quite easy, if you plan for it, to have strap-on weapons, where you can slap on weapons on these, where you have the ability to launch weapons based on targeting information that is given to you by someone else. So you need not have the sensors yourself, but you have someone who can provide you the coordinates where you can launch a weapon rapidly. Same applies to Coast Guard. Coast Guard also we should be able to weaponize quite rapidly. Submarines we've already talked about. That I think for whatever be the complexities, of while surface detection is becoming easier and easier by the day, largely based on satellite based assets. Undersea detection still remains a problem. So, therefore, I would say a strong emphasis on undersea. And on ships, of course, on ships we have to, and how best we invest on ships, we have to decide on next generation corvettes, frigates, destroyers, and take a view on the long term prospects of aircraft carriers and where they stand. So, this is all I would say open for discussion. Yeah.
How important is maritime for a country, for a nation to become a superpower? Like the US, we know how strong their naval forces is. To counter that, is China on the right track to become a superpower, and is maritime a way to reach there quicker?
To my mind, it is a critical requirement. I mean, there is no getting, particularly in today's interconnected world. And when you see, we are all looking at comparative advantage. Trade is all about comparative advantage. I mean, you can maximize your GDP in a sense by focusing on areas where you have a comparative advantage. And if you don't have a comparative advantage in somewhere else, you let another nation produce that who has greater advantages, and you exchange your goods and services. That's what trade is all about. And if you can do that effectively, then you can ramp up your economic progress quite rapidly because you're deploying resources where you have an advantage. If you're doing that, then you need the ability to sort of control the medium to some extent also, yeah, on which that trade is taking place. We are practically, an island nation in a sense because our ability to trade through land-based routes is extremely limited, yeah, because of the complex, firstly, geography, and then geopolitically also you're sort of, in a sense, isolated because of your relationship with your neighbors in that sense. So maritime is fundamental to us. I mean, you look at nations in the past, even continental powers have always aspired to be maritime powers. You take France, for example. In the Napoleonic era, I mean, they realized the limitation of being a continental power and then desired to become a maritime power, which got snubbed, I would say, in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where he lost to Nelson, yeah, and his fleet was destroyed. Yeah. Russia has tried that too. As a continental power, you have to become a maritime power. Partly that ambition got decimated in the Battle of Tsushima against the Japanese, which took place, I think, in 1905. Yeah. Partially, I would say, even after that, in more modern Soviet times, when they again went into carrier shipbuilding, etc. But then the breakup of the Soviet Union, again constrained their resources to do that. Germany has tried to become a maritime power. In the First World War, they lost that war and they scuttled most of their fleet, I would say, in Scapa at the end of it. In the build up to the Second World War in Hitler's time, also, they focused on large battleships, the Bismarck, the Tirpitz. But after, I would say, in the early sinking of the Bismarck, and then Admiral Raeder was sort of lost his job, and Admiral Donitz, a submariner, came. And then they changed their philosophy into a sea denial sort of force and to focus more on submarines. So every nation, continental powers have also desired to make that transition from a continental power to a maritime power. And to my mind, the only country which has been successful in doing that is China. They were traditionally a continental power, but today, on any parameter, they're a maritime power as well. So they have really made that transition. For us, it is important for us to invest in the maritime sector. The maritime sector is the future. I mean, that interconnectivity is a must. We would be foolish to not invest into our maritime sector in all its aspects. So in the commercial side, on the military side, in all its aspects, we need to sort of think maritime. Yeah.
Where is India placed at the moment as a maritime nation?
In some sectors, we've done quite well. Number of seafarers is, I think, we are the third largest provider of seafarers globally. So we have in any ship today, that's why you see any incident takes place in West Asia by the Houthis, etc., you'll always find a strong element of Indian crew on them. Yeah. But in other sectors, I think we have not done well at all, particularly in shipbuilding. Shipbuilding commercial, we're extremely weak. And now, while there's a lot of talk of reviving the sector, one hopes that we succeed because it's a very important part of your entire maritime ecosystem. Is that you have to be a capable shipbuilder. You have to make sure that a reasonable part of your cargo, I mean, we are doing only, I think, 7% of Indian cargo on Indian bottoms. The number is quite abysmal. It has to be a reasonable percentage that, travels. It's a security requirement also. In shipbreaking, we've done well. Again, shipbreaking in Alang, etc., we are large shipbreaking yards. So there are sectors in which we've done well. From an investment standpoint in our forces, in the Navy, I think there is room to increase that further. I understand that we have major boundary issues. But one of the ways of tackling those boundary issues is also a maritime approach. So these should not be seen in separate pots. They're part of the same sort of security system. If you're able to exert maritime pressure, you can influence decisions that take place on your land boundaries also. So one can be leveraged for the other also.
Right. So a problem that we see in the Indo-Ocean, since you mentioned Houthis, was that there's a lot of terrorism and piracy that we see. How is India countering that in the Indian Ocean?
Oh, we've done exceptionally well in that sector, I would say. Piracy was first curbed, but when everyone's was distracted by what's happening by the Houthi random attacks that are taking place on merchant shipping, and the anti piracy sort of effort got throttled slightly, it surged again straight away. And that's the time when the Indian Navy stepped in strength, addressing the issue. We've done exceptionally well over there. We need to be always cognizant of the fact that this is a maritime security issue and is not the fundamental tasking of the Indian Navy. So the coast guards, etc., for them, it is really a major issue for them. But for us, our main issue is really be able to deter conflict and in case conflict occurs, to be able to decisively win in that conflict. So that requires a certain amount of preparation, tasking at all times. And while we engage in these activities, this is more of a additional task and not your primary task in that sense.
Love to hear that, sir, that we are amping up our power in maritime, because that is an essential part as well. So to end this conversation, a very insightful conversation, we have a tradition at DOAP that the previous guest leaves a question for you. Yeah. There's a question left by Professor Shrikant Kondapalli for you, of course, on the question of China. He says,
how do you quantify the Chinese defense budget? And how do you cater for different services like Army, Navy, Air Force, rocket forces, and specialized forces in China?
To some extent, I already covered this.
You did.
As I said, 2023-24 Chinese defense budget, declared defense budget, was 1.55 trillion yuan. Exchange rates keep sort of fluctuating, but roughly that amounts to is $220 billion, which as a percentage of their GDP, if you assume their GDP to be around $17.8 trillion, is around 1.29% in that region. So it's quite low. Now there are large agencies, the US DoD report, IISS, SIPRI, which examine this report in great detail. And then because every nation has a way on which they count numbers, what is included in the defense budget, what is not included, etc. And they make a correction. If you average out that correction from these agencies, it is roughly in the region of around 50%. They say China underreports by 50%. So 220 jumps up to $330 billion, right? But this does not make a correction for purchasing power parity. Just to give you an example, Chinese pay scales are roughly the same for their officials as what we have. It's quite similar. In the US, you would be paying 8 to 10 times more, for a sailor or for an officer. Maybe not 8 to 10 times, maybe at least 5 to 6 times more, if not. So your manpower costs are significantly lower in China. American Enterprise Institute tried to deep dive into this and make a correction, and they threw out a number which to my mind might be slightly inflated of $711 billion. $711 billion. So let's assume that that figure is sort of incorrect. Purchasing power correction, if you go by the standard, difference between what the World Bank brings out, is for China, it's roughly around 1.9 to 1 to 2 is a correction. So 330 can jump up to $500 to $600 billion in terms of purchasing power. Now, if you say what the Navy gets out of that, let's take a lesser figure. Let's take $500 billion with a purchasing power correction. If the Navy gets around 30% of that, you're looking at, or 25 to 30%, you're looking at $125 to $130 billion. And because manpower costs are low and operating costs also in China are slightly low because their shipyards are quite efficient and their manpower comes cheap. So to say that 50% of your income is going in capital assets, in generation of capital assets, that's quite an easy sort of transition. $50-60 billion for being devoted towards generation of capital assets in an armed force in the Navy every year is a colossal sum. As I said, we're doing $6 billion. So that is a difference that we have to be cognizant of. It would be, in terms of capital spending, I don't think they're doing any less than what the United States Navy does in terms of capital spending. And that's why you're seeing these numbers. I mean, if the US does around 4 to 5, 6 ships a year. Some might be large, but now so is China doing large ships. I mean, the Fujian is around 80,000 tons. A Ford class carrier is 100,000 tons, so not much difference between the two. LPDs, they're coming out, 45,000 tons. The Type 076 is going to be 55,000 tons. So I think, this earlier interpretation that China makes only small ships and the US makes big ships, that's also sort of gone. In tonnage for tonnage terms, for the last 3 years, Chinese shipbuilding has been more than what US is doing for the Navy is concerned. So it's a formidable force that is being created. It's a question that you cannot duck. Sometimes what happens if you don't have a good answer to a problem, it's the ostrich solution, you duck the question itself.
Yeah.
This is a question that has to be seen on its face, that this is the force that is being created. Now, how this force sort of transforms itself into how it's going to be utilized is for us yet to see. But in that, it's always better to assume the worst, So to assume that this force can be used in ways which are not in congruence to your own security needs. And therefore, how to combat this force should be, whether that combat emerges or not, but how to combat it in our thinking at least has to be mainstreamed at all times. And to do it in the most efficient, cost-effective manner, using asymmetric means, because as I mentioned earlier, you can't compete with China symmetrically. You have to look asymmetric. Thanks.
Being prepared for the worst is what you're saying. Well said, sir. Yeah. Can I request you to leave a question for our next guest?
If you ask me, a fundamental issue for us in our country is how can we convert capital, the money that we deploy, into capabilities in the most efficient manner. And I think that has to be, that is really a question that all of us grapple with. It's got many moving parts. Where do you deploy that capital? And how do you deploy it? And how do you make your industry far more efficient to convert that capital into assets? So it would be interesting to see as to what are the possibilities in that respect, because I think we've got an issue that our conversion ratio is low and we need to improve that ratio.
To end this conversation, I would like to ask you a question for myself. Since this is called Diary of a Publisher, I make sure to ask my guests a question. If there was a book that you wish you would have read earlier in life, any subject that made you the person you are today, what book would that be?
So let me talk about a book called Blind Man's Bluff. Yeah, it speaks of, it's a US book on the Cold War exploitation of nuclear submarines. Right? It's a fascinating book on how aggressively you can utilize these platforms, attack submarines. And I think it is for anyone, of course, if you're part of the profession, if you're a submariner, but even if you're not, it's very insightful as to how you can be really innovative and aggressive in employing a capability to produce, to get the information or to make sure that you can optimally utilize that platform. It's an expensive platform, but how you can optimally utilize the platform. And it's uplifting. It is a book that is teaches you the art of what is possible. I enjoyed that book and I would recommend it for anyone.
Wow, so this has been such an insightful conversation for me. And looking at this conversation, I could have, changed this conversation to many other subjects in geopolitics because there's so much wisdom you have. Having said that, thank you so much for sparing the time and gracing your presence at the Publisher. We really appreciate you. I'm sure audience had a lot to take away as well.
Thanks, Shivam. Enjoyed being part of this. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
We at TOAP are working really hard to take this podcast to the next level. Our guests are going to get even better. Our production quality is going to get even better. And hopefully, I'm going to get even better too. Most importantly, we are committed to being consistent and continue to do what we love the most. Until then, keep reimagining yourself and know that the power of change lies within you. Jai Hind.